it's a really interesting point, because it's almost got to the point now whereby masculinity is seen as a negative thing.
The strengths of masculinity and manhood, unfortunately, are being used against men at times. Normal masculine strength or their ability to perhaps assert themselves being misconstrued. Attacking fathers, for example. When was about a year ago, I went to the beach reading a book, just relaxing, and the peace in the environment was disrupted by a lady in the background that started shrieking, quite a lot of verbal barrage, and I quickly had a glance, and she was actually verbally abusing her husband, and it went on for quite a few minutes. What struck me from that was a couple of things. He actually assertively responded to her. I was quite impressed in his ability to assertively communicate back. And that was particularly important role modelling for their 5-year-old son that was also in the middle observing this verbal barrage. But the other component was her turning around to her son and saying, "Your father's an idiot." And hands down, that's just wrong. So there's this demeaning of the father role in insults like that, for example.
I'm horrified to hear that, and I'm more.
I was horrified to hear it.
Yeah, but I'm also more horrified reading through all of these notes to discover that abuse against men is a whole lot more common than we think.
It is. Australia really needs to have this conversation. Where women were many decades ago in terms of the silent phenomena of domestic abuse is really where men are at now. I'm not sure if you're aware, our own Australian Bureau of Statistics, there's a statistic in there that 70% of male victims experience assault by a female perpetrator in the home. And that's a higher number than the female victims at 64%. Why aren't we talking about those numbers?
Well,
How's a man
going to talk about that?
Yeah.
Where's he going to go? Is he going to go to some authority and say, my wife is beating me or something? Well, they're not going to be believed, are they?
That reminds me of the story this guy was telling me the other day. And he was telling me how, I guess he was in a club and he was with a new girl, and his ex-girlfriend had seen him, and then it went up to him and started beating on him and slapping him and abusing him. Right? This is not okay to do. You can't just batter someone. That's exactly what was going on. And this guy, he went to the police station and he said he would like to file a restraining order. And they were like, okay, we're listening. Who? What happened? What's going on? And he said, well, my ex-girlfriend, this woman, was hitting me, and I don't want this to happen anymore, and I want to file a restraining order. And there was this female cop there who looked at him and apparently started bursting out laughing at his story. And she was reluctant to follow through with it. It was almost like she actually didn't want this to happen. She didn't want her fellow woman to get a restraining order put on her. She didn't want her fellow woman to be put in this position or placed as the bad guy here. And on top of that, she thought it was funny. She thought it was laughable that this guy wanted to file a restraining order. It's ridiculous. He was facing emasculation from a female police officer when he wanted to file a restraining order. How ridiculous is that? It's funny. I pictured this woman in my head, and you might be picturing her too, but I asked this guy, I was like, was she overweight? Was she obese? He's like, yeah. And I guess it's kind of irrelevant, but it's the exact type of woman that I was picturing in my head. Sort of this overweight police officer who's just kind of like maybe a little bit anti-male, maybe a little bit of a feminist, maybe a little bit left-leaning, which is kind of usually not the case with police officers, right? Usually they're pretty right-leaning, traditional, this sort of God-fearing type thing. Blue lives matter, wave the blue flag around. Typically they aren't sort of liberals, and maybe this woman wasn't. But this perception or this image that was placed in my head of this woman was overweight and kind of immature. And yeah, I was right. And yeah, so, that reminded me of that story. That's absolutely ridiculous, right? That pissed me off when I heard that. This female cop was laughing at him. And I think she even said something like, oh, are you scared that she's going to beat you up? Like she was fucking with the guy. She was emasculating him. Crazy.
Well, exactly.
taken
This is part of
seriously.
the social influences and the social determinants of health that we need to really put onto the table, particularly in looking at a national men's health policy, because of these kind of issues. The kind of abuse a man may experience by a female perpetrator, a woman's not likely to pack a punch the way a male would, for example, but women abusers, unfortunately, may be very good at sugar-coated viper tongues. So there'll be a lot of statements that are hit below the belt.
Like your dad's an idiot.
Like your father's an idiot, or you think you're a man, or...
This woman is spot on. Below the belt. That's it. That's it right there. Below the belt. That's all you need to say about these women when they attack you verbally. It's below the belt. It's the things you revealed to her 2 years ago when you were in your most vulnerable state and emotional, and you decided, gee, maybe I'll open up to her, without knowing 2 years later she was going to fucking punch you with that shit right below your belt. And she's going to prove to you why you can't be vulnerable with these females. Because, yeah, they'll go below the belt. They'll take the things you told them in privacy, trusting that you could open up to her. And she will use that against you. And I'm sure just about every man watching this will attest to that and say, yep, you know what? Happened to me too. Happened to me too. And ultimately, this is why you really got to be careful about opening up to women and being vulnerable and being tender, or maybe even crying. And also, you really shouldn't argue with women either. There's no reason to argue with them. Like, to go back in a verbal shouting match, there's no point, man. Because in many ways they're better at it than you. It's funny, they take away your main threat as a man, which is physicality, but we don't take away their main threat, which is their verbal tongue that usually goes below the belt.
You think you're good in bed. Another example in social media that we see quite often, or might hear quite often and don't bat an eyelid at, are things like on the radio a few weeks ago. This particular radio station had a wife calling in to tell her husband of over 10 years that he doesn't sexually satisfy her, and doing that over radio. And I just wonder, would the radio have had the husband do that to the wife?
Yes.
You raise a very interesting point.
How would we react to that? And yet we sort of go, ha, that's funny. And yet, is it really? You're hitting men at an important part of their identity. Quite literally and metaphorically, you're hitting them below the belt. And it's very insulting to men.
We see it in the media often as well, don't we?
We see many images that we don't bat out an eyelid very much. So, yeah, away from the domestic front, we've got quite a few images, whether it be in video clips or commercials, that we kind of look at and go, oh, yeah. But if we were to reverse them, I wonder if we'd feel the same. So there's some examples we can look at here.
This is a Pink film clip. Now, she's being particularly aggressive towards this guy here.
Well, Pink's a great performer and she's got an awesome personality. I just want to hug her. We have a look at images like that, and
if that was reversed, we would be outraged.
It's totally acceptable. We don't question that.
There
when we
would
look
be
at that,
an uproar, but that's kind of entertainment that we're having a look at there and going, hang on a minute, that's actually inappropriate and unacceptable behaviour. And we're airing it. So that's an example there. That role modelling to young girls or young boys is quite frightening. And when you have a look at Canadian research where they're looking at adolescent girls and adolescent boys and partner aggression, about 34% of the young girls admitted to hitting, biting and scratching their partner, compared to 2.6% of the boys. And I think it was 18% of the girls used a weapon against their partner, compared to 0% of the boys using a weapon against their partner. That research also showed that young girls observing their mother being aggressive toward their partner, the young girls would also significantly report being aggressive. And so that kind of role modelling, we're missing the point. So there's a couple of other examples we can look at.
Yeah, respect, isn't it, Elizabeth?
Basic civility and courtesy amongst people.
You know, and that whole concept of fighting fairly and not reducing a fight to personalised name calling.
It's really learning how to fight back fairly. That lady I mentioned earlier at the beach, she, quite professionally speaking, needed anger management training. And so it's the ability to be able to treat people.
Bro, a lot of them do. A lot of them do. That's a great point. I think that's not talked about enough. I think a lot of these women have very bad anger. They have very bad anger issues. And I'm not going to sit here and act like that's not something I've ever dealt with in my life, because it is. I'm a pretty chill person, but when I get angry, or at least when I did in the past, I would get very, very angry. But thankfully, I've found some outlets, and that is in many ways my anger management. But with a lot of these women, man, a lot of them never get checked. They're spoiled, they're privileged, they're shielded from things in life. Nobody ever challenges them or checks them. Everybody lies to them and hypes them up because we all want to sleep with them, because men want to sleep with them. And so they never get told the truth. They never get checked. And then when they finally get checked, they get infuriated. It's just a great example of how, we can beat up on men in the mainstream media and movies and television. We could shit on them. We could treat them as punching bags inside of relationships on television. But like when the things are shifted and things are changed and it's pointed in the direction of women, you will hear about it. Like they don't take that shit kindly. Like men kind of take it. Kind of like, yeah, whatever. We kind of tolerate it in many ways. That's how it's gotten this far. But when the shoe's on the other foot and it's women at a disadvantage, you're going to hear about it. They're loud. They come at you hard. They come in forces. They protest. They fight back because they get triggered. They get offended. They come together. They can't have this. They get infuriated. And so inside of relationships and when you're dealing with them, they're double standards. You call them out. They're gaslighting. I mean, their anger is bad. She is absolutely right. A lot of them need anger management.
People to fight back, teach people to fight back fairly. That's what I teach a lot of men, in being able to learn assertive communication skills. And I'm glad to say women also coming to seek help to go, I don't want to behave that way. I know I can feel my viper tongue coming out, but I pull back. But how do I express my frustration? And that's absolutely brilliant, that people want to learn how to fight back fairly.
Let's take a look at another example
yes.
of this concern in the media. This is a fairly common, I think it's a transport accident commercial?
It was about speeding, a transport accident, that's right. Now, we have a look at this. Now, it's making a point about speeding, obviously, but here they're making an issue about the size of his penis, obviously, and equating speed with his masculinity and insulting him. Now, I'm not particularly seeing any ads about speeding females and the size of their breasts and any connection to their brain, for example, of which we could come up with some pretty crude
You can
images.
imagine if there was a blonde woman driving the car and the blokes, looked at her and did
and
that,
sort of going,
we would be offended.
or what's going on,
Yeah.
like are your brains in your breasts or something.
it
I
wouldn't
even
happen.
Well, that's what I'm saying is you would hear about it. Like their anger is so bad. They get so triggered. They get so offended. They are in many ways like sort of snowflakes. They get very offended and they get triggered. And so you would hear about it. And that's why you can't do this, because you would hear about it. And so it's that same anger that you experience when you actually deal with them one-on-one and perhaps get into an argument. They immediately blow the belt. They're so angry, they want to just tear you down. And so what they're saying is, if that was a blonde woman and they were equating how fast she was going to the size of her breasts or the size of her brains, they would very obviously be infuriated. But a lot of men are just kind of like, we don't really take it as personal maybe. We don't get as offended. But what's happening is that it's been so chronic and it's been so consistent and it's become so pervasive that men are actually starting to realize this, and they're getting tired of it. And it's getting old. And it's like, it's not only affecting, like it's actually starting to seep into areas of real world. Like when it comes to sort of false, I got to be careful what I'm saying. When it sort of comes to like weaponizing systems against men and men being punished for those things, maybe they're false. This is real world implications. This is real world examples of how this sort of anti-male sort of stuff carries over into real life. It goes from commercials and social media and TV shows and movies and maybe even billboards, these things, and it carries over into like the justice system, into the courts, into yeah, right? Relationships. It's a big problem.
Cringe at saying it, but
Yes.
we would not put up with it. We
Well, it wouldn't even happen.
"Oh, wait a second.
It is
It wouldn't
really
happen. It wouldn't be on the
If an
drawing board.
advertising,
It wouldn't be on the drawing board.
Yeah, because
and
they
yet it gets to this point
such
in
a
these
big
particular
fuss.
commercials, and we're looking at it going, ha. You go, hang on a minute, that is inappropriate and unacceptable behaviour between people, and yet men are really being oppressed by it, and we're accepting it more toward men, whereas we would have an uproar toward women. It's really demeaning, and it's not role modelling.
So
good things.
emotionally, how are men responding to this? I mean, what's the impact?
Men have actually, unfortunately, they're aware of it, but there's, psychologically speaking, they've like developed a learned helplessness in a sense, where it's just like, even if I do say something, I won't be taken seriously, or I'll be insulted, or I'll cop retaliation, or I'll cop the silent treatment. And as you were mentioning before, where do I go? Because when I report it, or I want to make a report, I'm either laughed at, or, come on, you're a bloke, be tough,
Yeah,
or,
deal with it.
how,
Or-
you mean she hits you?
Absolutely.
Nah, that's not
What's wrong
possible.
with it? Yeah.
What's wrong with you? And men are even experiencing that I'm less of a man because of it, feeling quite shameful about it. rather
Because they're
than-
copying it.
But the thing with abuse toward men is that the abuse, verbal abuse, emotional manipulation, sexual manipulation, or using children as negotiating tools, they are forms of abuse that are hard to detect and they're hard to defend against. So it tends to seep under the skin psychologically that someone ends up a little battered, so to speak, or helpless, doesn't know how to fight back, and in the end gets so frustrated that they're just trying to cope and maintain an identity.
So just wrapping this up, so the Men's and Fathers Health Summit in Canberra has now recommended a mandatory review of all legislation. How significant is that move?
That is a very important recommendation that they've made. A lot of us were really pushing for an Office for Men status. Now, they didn't recommend for that, which I fully support that they didn't, given that there could be a risk of mismanagement with that. But the mandatory review of legislation and policy for its impact on men, for the reasons we've just discussed, are paramount, both on government policy level, domestic abuse front, and day-to-day level with some of the examples we've spoken about, because we're letting it slide and not stopping to question, saying, hang on a minute, if we had a man doing that to a woman and we showed that publicly, we would not accept it. Why are we accepting it for men? Why are we not questioning these things and having just as much of an uproar? They're important social determinants and social influences that are impacting on men's health, physically, psychologically, family and social-wise.
It's funny how all this exists, all this is going on, and then we still have feminists and all them running around and leftists saying and insisting that women are oppressed. It's so funny. And I'll continue to say it. But when it comes to propaganda, one of the things you want to do is you want to accuse the other side of doing exactly what you're doing. So they want to say, oh, they're the ones being oppressed, women are so oppressed, when in reality, they're oppressing the men very, very strongly. And just saying that will make people laugh, but I don't care. I don't care. These things need to be talked about. And this is Dr. Elizabeth Seeley. And this video here, my friends, 14 years ago. 14 years. Now let me ask you this. Do you think it's gotten better or worse? It's gotten worse.